Good afternoon and welcome to the first Posturite webinar of 2026, When Striving Becomes Stress, the double-edged sword of perfectionism at work. My name is Tom Nagel. I'm part of the Posturite team, and thank you for joining us on this wet and grey day, at least down here in East Sussex. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ellis. Uh, Ellis is an accredited business psychologist. She has a master's degree in psychology and further training in both counseling and education. She is the founder of Mindset Mental Health, a principal practitioner of the Association of Business Psychologists, and a graduate member of the British Psychological Society. That's a mouthful, but we got there in the end. Ellis has worked with POS right now for a number of years to deliver some of our neurodiversity and mental health assessments and coaching. So she is more than qualified to talk to us today about stress and the implications of that on perfectionism. So let's wait no longer. Ellis, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar, and yeah, I'm going to hand over to you.
You for such a good introduction, Tom. Yeah, hello everybody, and if you are watching the recording as well, hello. Thank you for taking the time to watch or catch up with the webinar. I actually had the inspiration for this webinar after having some discussions with colleagues on Stress Awareness Day, so I'm quite excited to take a different angle to what we often see around stress in the workplace. Because we were saying that often when we talk about stress of work, we often focus on things like our workload or deadlines and the amount of hours that we're putting into things, which are all absolutely valid causes. But today I would like to explore something a little deeper, which is sometimes one of the hidden contributors to stress that I think flies under the radar, and that is perfectionism. So, perfectionism can look like dedication or commitment on the surface, but sometimes we might see the colleague who's going the extra mile, who never seems to miss a detail, but underneath it can drive our exhaustion, our stress, and unfortunately lead to things like burnout. So, in this session, I'd like to unpack what perfectionism really is, what the research tells us about its impact, and most importantly, what do we do about it? And we'll look at how both individuals and organizations can overcome it and support stress and well-being at work. So let's start with a simple definition. Perfectionism is described as having exceedingly high standards along with harsh self-critical evaluation. Now, there's nothing wrong with having high standards in themselves. In fact, a lot of the time they can be really valuable and they help us grow and they can be very innovative and, high achieving. But perfectionism isn't really about just ambition or excellence. The key part of perfectionism is that second half of the definition, which is your critical evaluation. So, perfectionism isn't about wanting to do well, but sometimes more about never feeling good enough, no matter how well we actually are doing. It might be that internal voice that's kind of saying you could have done better, or that's something that they're going to notice, and it's a really tiny mistake. And over time, that self-criticism will erode somebody's confidence, create constant pressure. And that's why perfectionism is now recognized as quite a big psychological risk factor when it comes to stress and burnout. So when we're talking about perfectionism, we're looking a bit around the performance and well-being and how easily the pursuit of excellence can really turn into a source of strain for some. And I'd like to pause for a moment and perhaps get you to reflect on some of these statements, because I wonder how many of these might sound familiar to either yourself or people that you work with. So perhaps we have, I feel uncomfortable submitting work unless it's flawless. I often redo tasks because I doubt they're done right. Other people expect me to be perfect all the time. I rarely feel proud of my work for long. And I get frustrated when others don't match my standards. And lastly, if I make a mistake, I replay it over and over in my mind. And these are some of the common examples that we see in terms of our inner dialogue when it comes to those with more perfectionistic traits. So they're capturing a lot of sides of experience. There's that drive for excellence, and then the anxiety and stress that might come with it. And the purpose of this slide isn't to diagnose or label anyone, but it's just simply to notice in ourselves if one or two of these statements, or all of you, some of you have mentioned, if some of those are resonating with you, it doesn't mean that something's wrong. It often means you deeply care about doing things well, but it's important to reflect on whether that care is fueling your well-being or potentially draining it. And that can be a true sign of things like perfectionism. And there are different faces to perfectionism. There's actually three that I'm going to take you through now. And the first face of perfectionism is what we call perfectionistic strivings. So this is the part that often gets praised, particularly in the workplace. So this is the side of us that sets our high personal standards, the goals that are often self-imposed, and there's that drive in us to excel. And people high in this trait genuinely want to do things well. You're often quite diligent, reliable, and we see this a lot in our top performers at work. And in moderation, these are amazing qualities. In fact, the research does show that having perfectionistic strivings can have a small positive link to performance because it pushes us to be focused, organized, persistent. But if it's too strong, this is when it can also get tied with our sense of self-worth, and that can then start to create a lot of strain. So people might then start to overinvest in the tiny details and spend hours perfecting something that was already good enough, or maybe feel reluctant handing over tasks because no one else is going to do it right in the same way that I'm going to do it. And in the short term, it might look like dedication, but over time, it becomes quite unsustainable. You see things like people spending longer hours, taking less time to recover after work, finding it difficult to switch off, particularly in your evenings or your personal time, and that will eventually contribute to stress. So we need to be careful that whilst perfectionistic strivings can drive excellence, there needs to be some balance, otherwise it could potentially chip away our well-being. Now, the second phase of perfectionism is the one that's most closely linked to stress and burnout, and that is perfectionistic concerns. So this is where our high standards are actually meeting fear, doubt, and that self-criticism that unfortunately shows up for a lot of us with perfectionistic traits. So people with high perfectionistic concerns often feel that others might expect them to be flawless, and they might worry about being judged, making mistakes, or not meeting expectations. And this can drive us to do things like over-checking or having more procrastination and indecisions. And it's not because people don't care, but it's almost like we care too much. And the research consistently shows that this is the thing in perfectionism that is most closely linked to stress and poor well-being. It's often causing things like burnout, where we see signs like exhaustion, cynicism, or that feeling of being inadequate. It also shows that there's no positive relationship with workplace performance. So, in other words, people might work harder but not necessarily achieve more if they're experiencing these types of concerns. And you can start to see how this cycle becomes quite self-perpetuating. So the more self-critical we become, the more we start to overthink, try to avoid failure, which leads to a lot of exhaustion and perhaps even more self-criticism because we're not able to keep up with that first phase of perfectionism where we actually genuinely want to do well. And then we have the third phase, which is called other-oriented perfectionism. Or another way I remember this is where your lens shifts from me to we. Because the first two phases are mostly directed inward and it's focusing on our own performance and our own self-worth. Whereas other-oriented perfection is directed outwards on other people. So it's when people or someone holds the same impossible standards that they hold for themselves on other people. And you might recognize this in colleagues or perhaps leaders who become quite frustrated when other people don't meet their expectations, or perhaps they're really struggling to delegate work to others, or perhaps tend to micromanage because they don't trust that other work will be done to that standard that they're looking for. And the thing that's important to notice is that this doesn't often come from arrogance. It's actually more likely to come from the anxiety, stress, and the fear. If someone's self-worth is tied to this flawless performance, then anything short of perfect, even from other people, can almost feel like a threat. And that impact can be quite significant, not just on the individual, but also, of course, on the people around them. So we do see that teams working under perfectionistic leaders in particular often experience low well-being, low psychological safety because they feel like they can't make mistakes or admit they're not sure or ask for help. And over time, unfortunately, that climate within a team or a workplace will reduce really valuable things for people like creativity, innovation, trust, and sometimes even reinforce perfectionistic traits in other people. So when we think about perfectionism, it's not just about an individual pattern, but actually can become a bit of a collective culture in some places as well. So here we can see that perfectionism really can be a bit of a balancing act because on one side of the scale, there are some genuine strengths that come with some perfectionistic tendencies. They might experience more motivation, persistence, attention to detail, reliability, and that strong drive for achievement and structure, sorry. Um, and these qualities make people excellent at what they do, and they might bring a lot of care and precision and consistency that's really important to lots of workplaces. But on the other side, the same traits, when left unchecked, can actually have a negative effect. And that then drive for excellence quickly becomes things like overworking, the inability to delegate, the fear of um, handing something over to somebody else unless it's flawless. It can lead to difficulties in celebrating our successes because the goalposts keep moving or you're just never quite satisfied. And over time, as I keep saying, it fuels stress, anxiety, and potentially burnout. And it also doesn't just affect individuals, but unfortunately, it can damage trust and collaboration within teams and workforces. The one thing I want to make clear is that perfectionism isn't necessarily all good or all bad. It's just that it needs more of a balance and a lot more self-awareness, perhaps. And the goal isn't to eliminate these high standards, but to try and channel them in a way that's healthy, sustainable, and supportive of both performance as well as people's well-being. And what I found fascinating when I was researching this area is that research on perfectionism is constantly linking it to time investment at work. So we saw a range of studies, no matter what area of work that you work within, forms of perfectionism, whether it be strivings, concerns, or other orientated perfectionism, is often linked to longer working hours. So perfectionistic individuals consistently report spending longer hours at work. And it's not just during our normal typical working hours, but also outside of work. It's also noticed that those hours worked were particularly rigid and excessive, so perhaps finding it hard to stop and take a break, even if you are exhausted. So for some, it's not just about dedication, but it almost might come a bit more of a compulsion, where that internal pressure to get things right makes it difficult to step away, delegate, and define when that thing is finished. And that pattern actually shows up in all of the phases for perfectionism. Well, those with strivings will work longer because they're so driven to achieve. Those with concerns work longer because they're afraid to fall short. And whilst the motivations might differ, the outcome is often the same. So we see more hours, less recovery, and a higher risk of stress. So it highlights that perfectionism on the surface might look like commitment or high performance, but actually it might signal a deeper concern between effort and well-being. So here's a question for you to think about, and we've got a poll that's magically appeared. Thank you, Tom. Does perfection mean higher performance, or perfectionism mean higher performance? I'd love to know, do you think that if you are working more hours means you're more productive? I think there's a question that we rarely stop to ask ourselves. And nowadays, in today's climate of work, I really do see a lot of us struggling to switch off. And, we're working through our lunch breaks, we're finding it difficult and necessary to multitask, perhaps, so that we're always constantly busy. And I think this sits at the heart of this conversation. So, do we think that that means that we will have higher performance? Let's see the answers, shall we? Fantastic. So, we've got 62 for yes and 257 for no. Okay. Let's have a think about performance then. So I suppose on paper, it might look a bit logical where more hours might mean more output. But actually, what we do know is that while perfectionistic individuals might work longer, their performance doesn't necessarily improve. And what we tend to see is that once you get fatigued and you experience that cognitive overload, where your brain gets tired and is struggling to focus, and you might experience things like brain fog, that's when your productivity actually plateaus, and then it can really, really quite significantly drop. So the link, sorry, between effort and performance isn't linear. It's kind of more like a curve, and there is a point where the energy that we invest in work does stop creating value, and perhaps starts creating more risk. And that's not just for the quality of your work, but also for your well-being. Which is why I think it's so important for managers, organizations, and of course individuals to understand if you equate visible effort like long hours or constant availability with your performance, then that's unintentionally going to be rewarding perfectionism and burnout rather than effectiveness at work. So if you truly want to be high performers and have high performing workplaces, we have to start to redefine what does productivity look like and how can we make that work for the individuals and keep that to be healthy. It shouldn't be about how much time we put in or how productive we are with the time, but how effective or creative or sustainable that you work. And of course, rewarding rest as well as performance can be really important too. So when perfectionism starts to tip into healthy striving, into more self-criticism and pressure, we might start to see more signs of stress. And these aren't isolated symptoms. It's often part of a stress cycle that will build gradually. So it might start with overworking, and we might notice people staying late, checking and rechecking their work, pushing past the point of focus, finding it difficult to sleep, and might even make it harder to regulate their emotions as well. And as that tiredness builds, we start to experience more anxiety and self-doubt and wondering whether the work is good enough or if others are going to start to notice those mistakes. And anxiety often triggers rumination. So, that feeling where you replay conversations or decisions over and over and over in your mind. And in some cases, procrastination and avoidance, um, or avoidance, it feels safer not to act rather than risking the imperfection. So that's where the procrastination can start to impact people. And then over time, that will chip away at motivation. Some people become more cynical or detached when they think, what's the point? Which is one of the core features of burnout in particular. And what's interesting is that research shows that perfectionistic individuals often appear to be doing really well and high achieving for a really long time. And they're the people that you might describe as reliable or hardworking, but actually slowly behind the scenes, their stress levels are rising. And I want to take a moment to explore the relationship between neurodiversity and perfectionism. And we had lots of comments and questions around this. So I just wanted to thank you all for asking those questions, because it is a really important factor to consider. Um, so firstly, I want to say perfectionism is not a sign of neurodiversity, and it's not something that is inherent or inevitable for those of us that are neurodivergent. Um, what we often see is that perfectionism develops as more of an adaptive response to environments that many people with neurodivergent differences grow up and work in. So often, a good example of this is that many neurodivergent folks might have spent years receiving feedback, and that feedback can be quite explicit, could be sometimes subtle, but often it can be quite harsh. So people might have experiences with being told they're too much, or they're not good enough, or disorganized, or inconsistent, or getting things wrong. And over time, that striving for perfect can almost become a way of staying safe because they've had such criticism over that time. So, from that perspective, perfectionism is almost more of a protective strategy. And research and lived experience accounts particularly show that for the autistic and ADHD community, they may develop very high internal standards, particularly around professional context, as a way of counterbalancing uncertainty or managing that external judgment, or even masking differences in how they work. And that can then look similar to some of the perfectionistic traits. So, for example, we've got here fear of failure or disappointing others. As I said, that often comes from repeated experiences of being corrected or misunderstood or feeling like you're letting people down. Setting unrealistically high standards can become a form of self-protection, because if the bar is extremely high, it can feel safer than risking being judged or for getting something wrong. All or nothing thinking is common in perfectionism. And if something's not right, then it can feel like a total failure rather than part of a learning process. And comparison to others often reflects environments where neurodivergent people have unfortunately been measured against some really narrow definitions of productivity or success or performance, rather than supported to work differently. We've got here sensitivity to criticism, so sometimes referred to as rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And that's about heightened emotional responses that's often shaped by a lot of invalidation in the past from quite negative feedback. And that, of course, can lead to being discouraged by setbacks, because it can then have a high emotional or social cost. And of course, procrastination. If you feel uncertain or fear of getting it wrong or waiting until conditions are safe, it's not laziness or avoidance, but it's more about wanting clarity or wanting to feel safe and having the confidence before you start that task. So, what's really important here is that many strategies that we talk about today will support people with perfectionistic traits and are often quite inclusive standards to also support our neurodivergent colleagues as well. And things like clear expectations, structured feedback, realistic deadlines, compassion, it's all really helpful for absolutely everyone. And I'd like to encourage you, if you do have people who are showing signs of perfectionism, then rather than asking why is this person so perfectionistic, we could be more neuroaffirming by saying, what has that person learned that they need in order to feel safe, confident, and valued at work? That's a much safer question and more supportive question to ask. Now, so far we've looked mostly at how perfectionism affects the individual, but it is equally important to notice that the same patterns do start to then affect other people and shape team dynamics. So if somebody holds themselves to an extremely high standard, it can often extend to other people too. So they'll find it harder to delegate and they might worry that that person won't meet the same standard as them. Or something I often hear in my coaching sessions is, it's just quicker if I do it myself. And over time, that can create frustration or tension, both for the colleague experiencing any perfectionist traits and also for the colleagues that work with them. Especially see that in things like team members experiencing criticism or impatience, and that they then start to feel like what they're doing just isn't good enough. And on the other side, perfectionists can also become quite defensive or avoidant when they receive feedback because it can feel like confirmation of that second phase of perfectionism, and it's almost confirming the fears that they've fallen short. So everyone starts to then feel pressure to match these impossible standards, and the team culture will gradually shift from a more collaborative environment to something that's more comparison. And that is how perfectionism can almost become contagious. And it's not that people mean to spread it, but because behavior and expectations are modeled and then they're mirrored. And that's where we see perfectionism not just as an individual trait, but something that can quietly start to shape all of our workplace cultures. And that will take root and then spread across an organization. And it can start to show up in very recognizable ways. So here's some of the key themes that I see, or warning signs when I often see working with organizations where these perfectionistic traits have started to take root and go within the organization. Um, and this is one that I see a lot, is where busyness almost becomes a bit of a badge of honor, and leaders start to equate visible effort like long hours and having packed back-to-back diaries and replying to emails at any time of day, particularly outside of working hours, with some kind of commitment or being valued. And whilst those behaviors might look productive, as we've seen, it often signals less productivity, and more burnout. And the second red flag is a culture that punishes or punishes your mistakes rather than overworking. Punishes mistakes and rewards overworking. So these environments, people often feel like they can't make errors, and they can't admit that they're uncertain. And over time, people just stop taking risks and will start to keep playing it safe. And that leads directly to low psychological safety. And that's the sense that it's not safe to fail, it's not safe to challenge ideas or to speak up when something seems wrong. And when psychological safety drops, your innovation, your productivity will follow. If you've got people who are more cautious, more hesitant, overly reliant on what's already being done instead of experimenting and learning and trying new things, then that is going to have a negative impact on your organization. And finally, we see this chronic presenteeism. So you are physically at work, but you are mentally and emotionally drained. And you might be there, logged in because it feels safer to be doing that rather than taking a lunch break or scheduling some leave or maybe even leaving work on time. And all of that combined creates what I call this performance anxiety culture. So you're striving consistently, but nobody feels safe enough to exhale, take a break, or make a mistake. But the good news is you can do things about it. So if we talk about what we can do from an individual level, I like to frame this from criticism to compassion. Some of you have really graciously mentioned that you notice some of these patterns in yourself, and I definitely have as well. And perhaps some of you have noticed it in people around you. And there are some ways that we can start making some meaningful changes. And the first thing to do is start to build awareness and label it. If we can start to notice where perfectionism shows up, how it looks like for us, which phase it is that we're experiencing, you're more likely to start catching that moment, especially if you're rereading an email for the fifth time or hesitating to share a draft with somebody because it's not quite right yet. What one of those faces is showing up for you. And as soon as you start to build awareness and label it, that is the first step to starting to build more compassion and doing something about it. The second thing is to reframe mistakes and think about it more as progress. So instead of seeing evidence of errors as failure, try seeing them as data and as things that can help us improve next time. If we can start to shift that mindset into a more self-compassion view or something that helps us to learn, that can genuinely help us, particularly when it comes to our well-being. And I genuinely have to do this myself. I had to do it the other day because I was kicking myself. I've made a fair few mistakes in a research document that was raised by my supervisor. And I had to realize that this was the first phase of perfectionism rearing here for me because I was really reluctant to delegate it. I was really unwell over December. I didn't want to pass it on just before Christmas. Um, and as an ADHDer myself, also hate negative feedback, as I'm sure like most of us will, but it's more intense if you have experience of rejection sensitivity. So it can be really upsetting when you do experience mistakes. And I did have to try and reframe it for myself that actually this experience has taught me to share earlier if I'm feeling unwell, that it's okay to need help and that it's fine if I need someone to proofread work for me. And I did actually share this with my supervisor, and they were so understanding. So I probably really overthought how they would react. Um, and they were so understanding, and I've learned to also be more open rather than just to soldier on with that first phase of perfectionism, which I know I often do. And this is something that's helped me feel a bit more relaxed about that situation and perhaps, hopefully, less likely to have that problem next time. So that's my personal take on reframing mistakes and consider it more as data, as what we can do better for next time. And the third one's one of my favorites. And I noticed that a lot of you ask questions around this when we put questions out prior to the webinar. And this is a question to ask yourself: is this good enough for the purpose right now? We're not looking for perfect, but we're looking for fit for purpose. And so many of you quite rightly asked this question before the webinar: what is good enough? And I would say to you, before you start a project, or if you're struggling to know if something is done, think about the overall aim of that piece of work. if you can define a key objective, then that can help you decide what is good enough. Because if you've met that key objective, then everything else is probably just nice to have. And it could be that those nice to haves are suggestions for improvements for later on or the next project, not necessarily something that's essential for right now. So we need to separate what genuinely needs more work from what's already meeting its goal. And if you're struggling to think what's good enough, just go back to what is my overall aim for this piece of work? Have I met that key objective? And that can hopefully help you separate those things. And once we have that, we need to set some boundaries for what good enough actually looks like. So it's always best to do it before you start a task where you decide on what done will look like, because that way you have an end clear point and don't fall into that trap of endless polishing. But I will say it does still work. If you haven't yet done this and you need to do it towards the end, it's fine to do that as well. So think about what does done look like? What is the overall aims? And write that as a list, write key outcomes or key performance indicators and use those as your boundaries. Everything else is an idea for next time or a way we can improve it if we have more time, but we need to make sure we meet the deadlines. And finally, prioritize rest and recovery. Recovery is not the opposite of productivity, it's actually what sustains it. So we need to start giving people permission to switch off, help yourselves reset, allow you to show up with clarity and creativity. And I'm so worried that we're starting to see a workforce that feels the need to be constantly busy. You know, we're eating lunch whilst checking emails, or we're queuing and traveling whilst doing life admins on our phones and rarely taking breaks. Perhaps you're even watching this webinar and multitasking by trying to get work done at the same time. But sometimes the most productive thing you can do is rest. So please prioritize that. And that really will help with your perfectionism and your stress and well-being. So overall, these are some small practical steps, but over time, they do make a really big difference as an individual. As an organizational level, it's more about moving from this pressure to more purpose and creating a culture where people can perform well, and also hopefully stay well. And similarly to what we were talking about with good enough, the first step is to define what does performance and success actually mean to us in our team, in our organization. Um, too often we're just looking at effort and comparing that to excellent. But the person who stays latest or replies to emails at any time of day is not necessarily the most committed. And it certainly doesn't mean that that performance is effective or sustainable. So if organizations and leaders can really clarify what does good look like and make sure that it's achievable so that we can try and prevent those perfectionistic pressures from taking hold, especially for leaders, that good enough for your purpose and goals needs to be recognized so that you then don't end up holding other people to unrealistic standards, which of course is our third phase of perfectionism. And we want to model that as well and recognize that it's good to share drafts. When leaders are willing to say, this is a work in progress, I've not finished it yet, but I'm going to share and open to feedback, that starts to give permission for everybody else to do the same and normalizes this environment of learning and things not being entirely 100% finished. But often that's sometimes where learning and innovation can really thrive, and it invites people to be able to do exactly the same thing. It'll also help build that psychological safety, so fostering that environment where people can speak up, ask questions, and make mistakes. It's the absolute bedrock of high performing teams and one of the best anecdotes to perfectionism, antidotes, I should say. And then fourth, we have strength and resources. So not just reducing demands. I think so many of our workforces are being expected to do more with less nowadays. And because of this, it's really easy to recognize that our workloads are extremely much higher than before. And often when we're looking at stress, many people might focus on cutting workloads or hours. And of course, this might genuinely be essential for stress management. But what I will also say is that real well-being support does also come from ensuring people have the tools, the autonomy, and the time to do their best work. So we need to think about the resources that people have in order to thrive in the workplace, either with the role that they have or even well-being resources. I often call this, you are resourcing excellence rather than rescuing the exhaustion. So if demands are high, help people reach those high demands with the right resources, and that can help reduce stress and perfectionism. And finally, do check for those signals and provide support. We have a slide here which can demonstrate these are the signs or the patterns that often do show up in ourselves, in our teams. I've mentioned so many of these throughout today's webinar, but you might notice things like long hours and over checking, people delaying submitting work because it's never quite ready to share. Others might avoid showing drafts or early ideas because they're worried about that judgment. There's that all or nothing thinking where you have that sense of being like, if it's not flawless, then it's a failure. And that mindset can make small changes feel quite catastrophic. Many perfectionists experience that fear of criticism and excessive self-doubt, and constantly second guess if something is good enough or not. More on a team level, we might see this manifest through things like micromanagement, reluctance to delegate, frustration with others' work, because those same high internal standards are starting to be projected outward, which is our third phase of perfectionism. And I really want you to know that these are not signs of weakness or a lack of capability or poor management, but they're signs that often mean that people care deeply about their work and sometimes too deeply compared to their own well-being. And so if we can start to recognize these behaviors, either in ourselves or in other people, we can start to then have more compassionate and constructive conversations about what drives that and about how can we rebalance those expectations to support them and others. And at Mindset and Posturite, we do, our work is all about helping people and organizations support healthy work. So we do this in a few key ways. We offer individual support and coaching, where we support individuals to reframe some of their perfectionistic thinkings, build self-compassion, and develop more sustainable performance habits. And we particularly specialize in supporting neurodivergent people. And I also provide leadership development. We run awareness training and wellbeing workshops and webinars, just like this one. So keep an eye out for more webinars, and that can help also support stress and perfectionism at work. We do organizational consultancy if you're concerned about having poor psychological safety at work, for example, there's things that we can do to support you there. And we also do conduct workplace needs assessments, so helping employers create some practical adjustments that support people who might be struggling with their well-being, anxiety, neurodivergent traits. So if there's anything that we have covered that's resonated, either personally or professionally, we're always here if you want to continue the conversation. And I'm sure the team at Posturite will follow up with an email after the webinar. So know that it would be great to hear from you. And before we wrap up, I always like to finish my webinars on this last question, which is what will you remember, or what really stood out to you today? And if you're happy to share that in the chat box, I always think it's nice to understand what resonated most with you. And it's also helpful to anchor what you will remember and act on after the webinar. So let me know in the chat box what kind of resonated or what you remember taking away from this. Feel free to also think about your questions. Always happy to think about any questions from the Q&A, and I do know that we had some before we started the webinar, didn't we,
We certainly
Tom?
did, Ellis. Yeah. And first, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I mean, that resonated with me personally, and I can see it was clearly, obviously, yeah, a lot of people felt very seen in our chat box. I know you said you
Good.
weren't looking too closely at it, but I certainly was, and yeah,
Thank
it
you.
was certainly very impactful, and people are obviously um, sharing their stories. So thank you as well to our attendees today for sharing stories that they're happy to do so. Um, we certainly did get some questions in advance, and I'll just jump straight into those if that's okay. Um,
Absolutely.
the first one we have is how can we adopt these practices when we have stakeholders or managers who strive for perfection?
Ah, it's always my favorite when there's a leadership development kind of question. So if I had this, I would want to speak their language because they probably care about things like quality, reputation, and outcomes and things like that. So if I had any concerns about perfectionistic traits, I would frame any changes as things like risk management or sustainability. So if I was to approach them, I might say, we're seeing diminishing returns from things like additional hours. So we need to focus our effort to improve outcomes. And that might help to kind of shift if they are struggling to recognize their traits that and how it's affecting other people. If we're speaking their language and framing it in the way of outcomes, then that could potentially help open up that conversation. Um, and as I said, agree on the good enough standards to reduce the unnecessary overwork. And I would want to recognize that perfectionism can be a leadership risk. And sometimes looking at the evidence with that person can be really valuable as well. So showing them that it doesn't increase performance, for example, but actually more likely to increase fatigue. And that is a risk factor because then you're going to have people with stress, burnout, lack of creativity and accuracy. And those are the things that they value. So I would probably, yeah, reframe, speak their language.
Yeah, yeah, bring awareness, bring learning,
Mm,
understanding, all these great things that I know that your coaching and your assessments and training, sorry, will certainly cover.
yeah.
So moving on, this one is aimed at managers, and hopefully you have a few of those joining us today. What practical steps can we take as managers to create a culture that values effectiveness over exhaustion?
So again, those good enough standards clarify the expectations and the outputs as early as possible so that you know everyone knows what they're aiming for. That can help make it clear when things are done, when we don't need to just go down the endless polishing and correcting. Um, I would want to establish an environment where people felt safe to submit things that weren't yet finished as well. And if you can build that into your team meetings or team catch-ups, that's great. So encouraging people to submit work when it's not completely done yet, and to get feedback, that can be fantastic, which we're then starting to shape that culture where if it's not yet done, that's fine. We're going to talk about it. We're going to explore what is necessary. But like I said, you have to clarify the expectations first. And then when you do the draft review work, then you're making it clear what's good and what doesn't need polishing and what actually does then need to be done to meet that goal. Um, and I would thirdly say model rest and effort equally. So reward it, model it, do it yourself. Go for a lunch break. Don't sit and eat lunch and answer emails at your desk. Go for a walk, take annual leave, like do all of those things. reward it and model it for your whole team.
Yeah, that's very true. Finally, we have a question here that touches on stress risk assessments, which I will come on to towards the end of this call. But the question is, can you give examples of how the practical steps can be incorporated into a team management of stress risk management?
Yeah, so the health and safety executive have their stress risk management standards, so you could use those. And then throughout the webinar, we talked about the demands and agreeing outcomes and what is good enough. You can include that into your stress management. Do they know what is expected of them? Do they know what good enough actually looks like so that they're not then endlessly polishing work or striving to do too much? Um, in terms of control, that's another area of the management standards. In terms of delegation, so who build delegation into your expectations and also clarify whose role is what, because then that can help with your delegation. Um, relationships, I really do want to reinstate that managers need training in feedback. That's a really important part of being a manager. And often, as managers, we don't necessarily get that development training. So, being able to train people in delivering feedback, that is one of the biggest factors that impacts people's relationships in the workplace, um, especially with management. Um, and then in terms of culture and change. I'm trying to remember my risk management standards here. In terms of culture and change, um, measuring outcomes and key metrics, not just things like visibility, hours worked, what time they answered emails, those sorts of things. And it'd be great to see more stress management. Risk assessments include things like well-being and rest. Have they taken their annual leave? Are they taking their lunch breaks? Those sorts of things. It's absolutely vital.
Yeah, small changes can obviously add up and contribute to a bigger impact, I
Massively.
guess. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump straight into the
Thank you,
questions that
James.
we've received during the session. I'm conscious of time, so we'll try and fit in as many as we can, if that's okay. I'd want to
Go
start
for
with
it.
a good question from Judith here. She asks, is there any question on, sorry, is there any research, sorry, on differences between women and men in terms of levels and impact of perfectionism?
Or yes, it depends on what you're looking at. Which is really interesting. So, in terms of perfectionism and how we look or the environment that we're working within, we can see that there's different there in terms of male and female experiences, which we do also know is societally driven. There are unfortunately those standards that are uh, kind of come from the communities that we live in. So we do see that. It might also be that typically, sometimes you see that men are more likely to be the kind of key providers, and so unfortunately, they might then have some perfectionistic tendencies in terms of monetary outcomes and stuff like that. It's not the same for everybody, of course, but we do notice that perhaps they might be more financially driven. So there are some areas of research which do notice some differences between men and women, which unfortunately mostly just lead back to societal expectations. Um, and so I think that generally speaking, when it comes to workplaces, um, I would also say that women often feel like they need to fight for the positions that they're in. And so that then also leads to more risk of perfectionism in women in the workplace compared to men. But of course, it can, both um, sexes can experience the same.
Okay. Moving on to a question here from Dawn. Dawn essentially asks, how does imposter syndrome fit into this? What is the link between what you've obviously covered in your presentation and imposter syndrome specifically?
It's a good question, and that second phase in particular is nearly exactly what imposter syndrome is, right? So imposter syndrome, that feeling of not being good enough, and not being able to recognize good work when it happened, is pretty much the second phase of perfectionism. So you're absolutely right that it is integrated into this, really. You could almost reword that area as that second phase as imposter syndrome. But it's interesting that with perfectionism that there are three different places that's kind of broader, in terms of, um, that there you do have a balance between seeking excellence as well as that fear and self-criticism that might come from having imposter syndrome. And with just imposter syndrome, you might not necessarily have both, the drive for excellence as well.
Okay. Um, a question here from Sean. I mean, you did essentially cover this, I guess, in your presentation, Ellis, but Sean's asking, what would you say are the most common reasons for stress within business? I guess from your own personal experience,
Mm.
what would you say comes to mind in terms of the kind of recurring themes of the causes of stress within a workplace?
I will say it depends on the sector. Um, but generally speaking, one of the biggest things that I've seen, or the most common things that I've seen, is just how the workplace has been slowly rewritten to include lots of digital tools, which I don't think we were ready for, and we haven't necessarily got very good habits with them. So, for example, we all remember COVID and being forced to work from home, and suddenly our workplaces had to adopt a lot of digital tools like working through Teams and Zoom calls and things like that. And that has now become the norm at work, and everyone has access to our digital calendars and can just book time in to meet with us. And we are now seeing that we are just constantly switched on because the boundaries between home and work have been blurred because we can work from home. We take laptops and phones back home with us. We have access to our emails all of the time. People can access our calendars, and we have less control and autonomy over the time during the day. That often relates back to the digital tools that we're using. So the always switched on nature of work, I would say, is one of the biggest concerns that I have as a business psychologist at the moment, because we're just not learning to set very good we haven't learned to set very good boundaries with how we utilize our time at work, how we utilize other people's time, and the boundary between work and home life.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned sectors at the start of that answer because we have a question here that asks, are there certain jobs or industries which show more of an issue with perfectionism?
Yeah. One of the first things that came to mind when you said that is when you have an industry where you have standards in terms of billable hours.
Mm,
So professional services, I work with a law firm who for every 6 minutes of work, and their target around that is extreme. And so you do see a lot more perfectionistic tendencies in there where the standards are so extreme, and the pressure is incredibly high, particularly when it's linked to things like billable hours, I would say,
yep.
especially. So your finance sectors, your law, legal professions.
Sorry to cut in, but I'm
Go
glad you
on.
mentioned that, Ellis, because we have a question from Clive who asks about law firms specifically. Um,
Uh,
how can law firms reconcile the perfectionism that is inherent from the high stakes, detail-orientated nature of legal work, whilst protecting the psychological safety of their people? I mean, yeah, like you say, it's,
so
there's
hard,
there's
isn't it?
certain expectations that also need to be managed carefully, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's so hard, isn't it? Because especially when you've got high stakes, that's the thing. Where you really do need to set that definition as to what is good enough, and your good enough will still be quite a high level. But we need to set those boundaries in terms of what things do we need to be achieved in that particular area. Everything else is probably just a nice to have, and you're juggling so many different factors, that yeah, we really need to protect what actions absolutely need doing for the protection of our client or for the job essentially. But then everything else needs to be, that's a nice to have. But in terms of our billable hours or our goals and expectations, we don't have time for that, and we have to make our peace with that. But if we label it and make that list, then hopefully it makes it more comfortable for us to move away from perfectionism and more into um, effort and what is appropriate for the workload that we have.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time, as I said, and so I'm going to end on this last question, if that's okay.
Go
We had a
on.
few people asking about so it's condition focused. OCD or OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. What would you say, or are there any studies rather, between the types of perfection that you spoke about, but also those diagnosed with this particular condition? Are there any other factors in play, or is there a strong link there, or not so much? What would you have to say regarding that particular condition?
Will caveat this by saying that that's not my specialty, but what
Yep.
I will say is, obviously I do work in mental health, and with OCD is that you find that you have the compulsive thoughts as well as the behaviors, and those compulsive thoughts can almost feel like hearing voices for some people, and they're so difficult to dispel in your mind. And many of those intrusive thoughts are extremely dark thoughts, things that might not necessarily be um, easy to dispel or ignore. And that's what is driving the compulsive behavior. So, and more often than not, you do, correct me if I'm wrong, see that those obsessive thoughts are beliefs that something is going to go incredibly wrong, that there's a fear of harm to themselves or perhaps others, and in some cases can be more disproportionate to the situation than others. So I would say that with OCD, as I said, it's not my area of specialty, but I do understand that with compulsive thoughts, that it might be a bit different to, it will be a bit different to things like your imposter syndrome thoughts, and how it feels for that individual. So that's where I would say look at the area of compulsive thoughts and what's driving the behavior. That's probably where you'll see the key differences.
Okay, I've got to squeeze one more in, then I promise that's
Go
it.
on.
One from Nelson. It's coming back to the concept of good enough, which you spoke about earlier.
Yes.
Does adopting a good enough approach conflict with the goal of excellence at work?
No, it doesn't have to. I don't think it has to. I think that perhaps you can, there's a good question actually. You can still have high standards in good enough. I want that to be clear. So, that can still be a high standard, but it's driven by your values and what is needed for the project, I think would be my recommendation there. If you want to strive for anything else, that's where you must kind of refer back to, do we have time? Do we have the resources? Do we have the energy to be able to do these things? If not, then what you're left with should be still good. And that you're happy that it's met the goals that's necessary. Um, so it's like you could potentially think excellence is that next step, but we need to make sure that we have the resources to be able to meet that demand. That's probably what I would say for that question.
Okay, thank you. Right, I will wrap things up now. We've gone way over time, but that's okay. Just to let everyone know that everyone who signed up for this webinar will receive a follow-up email within the next 24 hours. Anyone who's joined our webinars before will know this contains a link to the recording, as well as a download of the slides and any other related information to do with this topic. And speaking of which, Ellice obviously spoke earlier in her presentation about some of the assessment types that she provides and Posturite and Mindset provides. Sorry. I'd like to specifically mention the stress risk assessments, the workplace needs assessments, and other services that Posturite provides for individuals who just do need that support in their workplace. But we also do have coaching and training services available for organizations, line managers. So we do cover these in the email tomorrow, but in the meantime, do feel free to reach out to your Posturite account manager. And if you don't know who that is, then please do contact sales@posturite.co.uk, and someone will certainly return your message and offer you more information or a chance to speak on a call regarding the services that we offer. Do make sure that you check the Posturite website for details of the future webinars. We do have a whole year of webinar sessions planned ahead, so as and when they get open for registration, they'll be added to the website. That's both the Posturite for Business and Posturite for Home websites. You'll easily find the links to those. Or make sure you're a member of our mailing list, and you'll receive your invitations to sign up. All that's left for me to say is thank you so much to Ellice for your time and your expertise today. It's been a fascinating session, and like I said earlier, obviously resonated very well and left a lot of impact on the people that join us today. Thank you to our attendees for joining, obviously, and yeah, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.